You don't make it to the cockpit of AC-130 Hercules by chance. Karl Hoerig was the kind of man who earned every stripe, every rank, every moment in the air. Born in Newton Falls, Ohio, a small, tight-knit town lined with modest homes and American flags waving from porches, Karl grew up with a quiet sense of duty sewn into his character. He didn't talk much about feelings. He talked about work, about service, about goals. His life was lived in motion, always forward, always upward. He loved planes before he could even drive a car. While most kids were taping posters of sports stars to their bedroom walls, Karl was sketching aircraft wings and memorizing the specs of fighter jets. After high school, he joined the U.S. Air Force, not for money, not for glory, but because it felt like the right thing to do. That's who Karl was, a man who did the right thing, even when it was hard. Over 2 decades, he rose through the ranks, eventually becoming a major in the Air Force Reserve. He flew in combat missions overseas, including in Iraq and Operation Desert Storm. He wasn't the kind of pilot who bragged about it, though. In fact, unless you knew him well, you might not even know what he did for a living. When Karl came home, he didn't wear his uniform in public. He wore jeans and clean polo shirts. He grilled steaks for his dad. He mowed the lawn like everyone else. But when he was in the sky, that was where he truly lived, in civilian life. Karl flew for United Airlines, guiding 747s and 757s across international airspace. Even after years of service, he'd still look out the window during takeoff, the light catching the edge of the wing, and feel the rush of pride. He had no criminal record, no enemies, no vices. He paid his bills on time. He helped elderly neighbors shovel snow. He called his parents every Sunday. His father, Ed Hoerig, often said, "If you could build the perfect son from scratch, you'd build Karl." But beneath his calm exterior, Karl had one deep, aching flaw. He was lonely. He had married once before. It didn't last. Being a pilot, especially in the military, meant being gone more than you were home. It was hard to build anything steady. By his early 40s, Karl had started to feel like the life he'd built had everything except someone to share it with. He wanted to settle down. He wanted a wife. He wanted peace. And that's what made him vulnerable. When he met Claudia, it felt like maybe, just maybe, he'd finally found the woman who could complete the picture. She was exotic, elegant, intelligent. She listened. She asked questions. She told him he was special. He had no way of knowing she had already chosen him for something else entirely. Karl met her online. It was 2005, and though he was a man of habit, even he understood that the world was changing. Dating websites had become the new way to meet people. Karl didn't have the time or the social energy for bars or setups. His work kept him in the air, and when he was home, he preferred quiet nights and home-cooked meals. But deep down, he craved connection. That's when Claudia Hoerig entered his life. She was striking, long dark hair, sharp eyes, a slight accent that hinted at mystery. Born in Brazil and naturalized as a U.S. citizen, Claudia had built a life for herself in America. She presented herself as smart, successful, and independent. She worked as a bookkeeper and lived alone. She told Karl she was looking for something serious, something real. At first, she seemed perfect. She laughed at his jokes. She said she admired his discipline. She told him he made her feel safe. For a man like Karl, loyal to a fault, modest to the core, her attention was intoxicating. He wanted to believe it was genuine. He wanted to believe she saw the good in him that others overlooked. They met in person. The chemistry was fast. Too fast. Within a few short months, they were married. Karl told his family it felt right, even if it was sudden. He believed in building a life, not waiting for it to fall from the sky. Claudia moved into his 2-story colonial in Newton Falls. She decorated the house. She took over the finances. She inserted herself into every part of his life. And at very first, Karl seemed happy. But underneath the surface, cracks were already forming. Marriage to Claudia wasn't a partnership. It was a performance, and one she expected to control. Karl was a man of routines. Morning coffee, folded uniforms, neatly organized travel bags. Claudia didn't respect that. She called it rigid. She complained he wasn't affectionate enough. When he tried to compromise, she shifted the rules. One day she would dote on him. The next she'd scream at him for leaving a dish in the sink. She wanted access to everything: his money, his schedule, his passwords. She accused him of being cold, secretive, emotionally distant. Karl, in his quiet way, tried to keep the peace. He believed in working through problems. He thought maybe she was just anxious. Maybe being far from her family in Brazil made her act out. Maybe he hadn't done enough to make her feel secure. But as the months passed, it became clear Claudia didn't want a husband. She wanted control. The fights got worse. She started showing up at his work unexpectedly. She threatened to leave him if he didn't change. Then she flipped the script, threatening to kill herself if he ever left her. Karl confided in a few close friends and family members. He said the relationship was a mistake. He was thinking about divorce, but he was scared. Scared of her mood swings. Scared of what she might do. Scared of what she already seemed capable of. No one knew then, but Claudia was already thinking in black and white terms. If I can't have him, no one will. She started planning. By the time March 2007 arrived, Karl Hoerig had made up his mind. He was done. The marriage had gone from tense to terrifying. He felt like a stranger in his own home, walking on eggshells around a woman who treated love like leverage. She monitored his every move, demanded to know where he was at all times, and flew into fits of rage if he so much as disagreed with her. Karl wasn't a man who ran from problems. He'd been shot at in the skies over Iraq, navigated aircraft through combat zones and thunderclouds. But this was different. This was inside the house. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't think. His calm demeanor had frayed into quiet despair. Friends said he looked thinner. His father noticed he sounded worn down on the phone. He started quietly moving money into a private account. He told a colleague at United Airlines that he was planning to divorce Claudia soon, maybe even that week. But Karl didn't know something important. Claudia was listening, and she had a plan of her own. It was March 10th, 2007, a cold Saturday morning. Claudia drove herself to a local gun shop in Trumbull County, Ohio. She didn't bring Karl. She didn't even tell him. She walked in alone, confident, composed, and requested to purchase a .357 Magnum revolver, a weapon designed for power, not protection. When the clerk asked why she needed it, she gave a rehearsed answer: home defense. But Claudia had never expressed interest in guns before. In fact, according to people close to her, she hated them. She'd always made Karl keep his military weapons locked and stored. Now, suddenly, she wanted one of the deadliest handguns on the market. She paid cash. She left quickly. The next day, she went to a firing range and practiced. Just once. Just enough to know how to aim, how to pull the trigger, how to make sure she didn't miss. And later that Sunday, while Karl was out, she logged onto a computer and bought a one-way ticket to Brazil, set for March 12th, the very next day. That night, she packed her suitcase. She placed a revolver in her bedroom drawer. Then she waited. The morning of March 12th, 2007, was like any other. Karl woke up early, as he always did before a flight. He was scheduled to pilot a United Airlines flight that afternoon. He had coffee, maybe checked the news. He probably straightened the bed, like he always did, perfectly tight, military style. It was still cold outside, just above freezing. A sliver of snow still clung to the edges of the lawn. He started down the stairs, dressed and ready to leave. That's when Claudia appeared at the bottom of the staircase, gun in hand. There was no shouting, no last-ditch argument, no warning shot. She fired once into his back. Karl collapsed forward, shocked, wounded, still breathing. She walked toward him calmly and fired twice more into his head. There was no struggle, no defensive wounds, no hesitation, only precision and cold intent. Karl Hoerig, war hero, pilot, son, and brother, was dead before his body hit the floor. Upstairs, Claudia calmly wiped down the revolver and left it behind. She packed her bags, checked her documents, grabbed the cash she had hidden, and drove Karl's car to Pittsburgh International Airport. There, she abandoned the vehicle and boarded her flight to New York. From there, she transferred to Sao Paulo, Brazil. By the time co-workers began calling Karl's phone to ask why he hadn't shown up for his flight, Claudia was already in the air, halfway across the Atlantic. When police finally broke into the house later that day, they found Karl's body lying at the base of the stairs, still dressed for work, blood pooled around his head. The keys to his car were still in his jacket pocket. There was no sign of forced entry. Nothing stolen, just 3 bullets, and an empty house. The phone started ringing by mid-afternoon. Karl Hoerig hadn't shown up for his scheduled United Airlines flight, and that alone was enough to raise alarms. He wasn't just punctual, he was exacting. The kind of man who would rather drive through a blizzard than cancel on responsibility. Missing a flight? That wasn't Karl. Coworkers called his cell. No answer. Then they tried his home phone. Nothing. That's when United contacted local authorities and requested a welfare check. Shortly before dusk on March 12, 2007, officers arrived at the quiet, well-kept house on Ridge Road in Newton Falls. The porch light was still on. The driveway was empty. No signs of a break-in. Nothing outwardly suspicious. But the moment they stepped inside, a heavy, unnatural silence filled the air. And then they saw him. Karl Hoerig, face down at the base of the stairs. A red stain had soaked into the hardwood floor. The pattern told the story. 1 shot from behind, and 2 more close range. His hands were limp. No weapon near the body. No signs of life. He was dressed for work. He had been ambushed. As investigators surveyed the scene, the questions began piling up. Where was Claudia? The car was missing. Her suitcase, clothes, and toiletries gone. There was no sign of forced entry. No valuables were taken. This wasn't a robbery. This was personal. Within hours, the house was marked off as a crime scene. By the next morning, her name was in the system. Claudia Hoerig was the prime suspect in the murder of her husband. The clues were everywhere. Surveillance footage from the gun store, her gun registration, the travel itinerary, the firing range log, and her banking activity in the days before the murder. She had purchased a one-way ticket to Sao Paulo. She had fled the country before Karl's body had even been discovered. And just like that, she was gone. A protected fugitive. Brazil has a long-standing constitutional law. It does not extradite its citizens to foreign countries. Claudia, born and raised in Brazil, was safe. She couldn't be touched. Even worse, Brazil's laws didn't just protect her. They welcomed her. Despite being wanted for murder, Claudia Hoerig settled in the small city of Pouso Alegre, in the state of Minas Gerais. She moved in with family, resumed a quiet life, and even began working as an accountant again. While Karl's family grieved, Claudia was going to the grocery store, making dinner, laughing at family birthdays. And for a while, it seemed like she had gotten away with it. Karl's family, broken but unrelenting. The Hoerig family was devastated. His father, Ed Hoerig, once said, "You think if someone dies in combat, at least it was war. At least they knew the risks. But this, in your own home, killed by the person you loved." The grief was deeper because it was unnatural. There was no way to explain it, no way to make sense of it. Karl had survived war zones, enemy fire, missions under the threat of death, and had been executed in his own house on a quiet Monday morning by his wife. But the Hoerigs didn't go silent. They wrote letters. They contacted Ohio senators and congressmen. They pushed for media attention. Congressman Tim Ryan, who represented their district, took up their cause personally. He worked with the U.S. Department of Justice, the State Department, and Interpol. Year after year, they fought to bring Claudia back. But Brazil's law was clear: no extradition of Brazilian nationals. Not even for murder. She was protected, until she wasn't. If Claudia Hoerig thought she'd disappeared into the hills of Brazil, she underestimated the tenacity of a grieving American family. She may have escaped the United States, but she hadn't escaped Karl's name. Year after year, the Hoerig family, led by Karl's father Ed and his brother Kurt, became warriors in their own right, not with weapons, but with petitions, court filings, and relentless pressure. They turned grief into action. They flooded the offices of senators. They met with diplomats. They reached out to news stations and journalists. They mailed letters to Washington, D.C., begging anyone who would listen to help bring Claudia back to face justice. And they had one powerful ally, Congressman Tim Ryan, who made the case personal. He called Claudia's escape an injustice to the country and to every veteran who ever wore the uniform. But time dragged on. Bureaucracy thickened. And Brazil, firm in its stance, refused to let go of its citizen. Every year on March 12th, the anniversary of Karl's murder, the family gathered at his grave. And every year, Claudia woke up in Brazil free. Then came a discovery. In 2013, after intense investigation by American and Brazilian legal teams, it was found that Claudia had technically renounced her Brazilian citizenship when she became a naturalized U.S. citizen years earlier. Under Brazilian law, you had to formally request to retain citizenship. She hadn't. Suddenly, she was no longer a Brazilian citizen. And just like that, her legal shield cracked. The Brazilian Supreme Court began reviewing the case. What had once seemed like an impenetrable wall now showed light through the cracks. The pressure from the U.S. government increased. Claudia tried to argue she was still Brazilian by birth. But Brazil, under public and diplomatic pressure, revoked her protections. For the first time since 2007, the possibility of justice returned. In early January 2018, after more than a decade of international legal fighting, Claudia Hoerig was handed over to U.S. authorities. She was placed on a flight from Sao Paulo to New York, escorted by federal agents. When she landed, she was arrested, shackled, and flown to Ohio, back to the small town where Karl had once believed he would build a quiet, happy life. When she entered Trumbull County Jail, she looked thinner, older, but she wore the same blank expression she had the day she pulled the trigger. She had run, but she hadn't. In 2019, over 12 years after Karl's death, Claudia Hoerig stood trial for aggravated murder. She took the stand. She cried. She claimed Karl had mentally abused her, told her she was worthless, made her feel like she didn't belong. She said she killed him in a moment of emotional collapse, an act of desperation, not premeditation. But the prosecution painted a different picture, one of calculated murder. They showed the receipts, the gun purchase, the practice shooting, the plane ticket bought before the murder, the bags packed, the escape route, the silence that followed. A woman who feared for her life doesn't wait calmly at the bottom of the stairs with a .357 Magnum. The jury didn't take long. After years of running, lying, and hiding behind laws, Claudia Hoerig was found guilty. The judge handed down her sentence. Life in prison, with no possibility of parole for 28 years, in accordance with Brazil's extradition terms. She was let out of the courtroom in handcuffs. This time, she wasn't boarding a plane. She was heading to a prison cell in Ohio. The house on Ridge Road still stands. From the outside, it looks ordinary. A modest, well-kept colonial home with white siding and clean windows. Nothing marks it as the site of a cold-blooded execution. Nothing says that just inside those walls, a man who had survived war zones was gunned down by the person he loved most. Karl Hoerig never made it out of that house, but his name did. For over a decade, his story echoed through courtrooms, congressional hearings, diplomatic chambers, and grieving veterans' halls. He became a symbol, not just of tragic loss, but of the power of persistence. Because Karl's family never let go. A father's grief, a brother's war. Karl's father, Ed Hoerig, was in his 80s when Claudia was finally extradited. He had written letters to senators and officials every month for years, begging for justice for his son. Each letter was measured and dignified, but you could read the heartbreak between every line. He once said, "I expected the military to take my son someday. That was the job he signed up for. But not her. Not like this." Karl's brother Kurt fought just as hard. He learned the legal system. He became fluent in diplomatic procedure. He made it his mission to see Claudia in chains. And when she was sentenced in 2019, the Hoerig family didn't celebrate. They simply breathed. For the first time in 12 years, they could rest. Claudia Hoerig is now inmate number W104177, serving her life sentence at the Ohio Reformatory for Women. She lives in a cell. She eats what she's given. She walks in a yard behind high fences. And she waits. She will not be eligible for parole until 2047, if she's alive. But in Newton Falls, and in the hearts of those who knew Karl, she's already forgotten. They don't speak her name if they don't have to. They speak his. He was more than a pilot. He was a man who believed in structure, in purpose, in keeping your promises. He believed in family. He believed in his country. He never raised his voice. He gave people second chances. That may have been his greatest strength and his deepest vulnerability. He trusted a woman who weaponized his kindness. But even in death, he didn't become a victim. His story became a movement. His memory became a cause. And his family's love for him tore down international walls to bring justice to a place that needed it badly. There's a folded flag that sits in a glass case in his family's home. A letter from the President of the United States. A photograph of Karl, smiling in his flight suit, standing beside a military aircraft. But the most important thing they have? His name cleared, not just as a victim of murder, but as a man who lived with integrity until the very end. The law caught up to Claudia Hoerig. Time caught up to her lies. And justice, like Karl in the cockpit of a jet, finally came roaring in, faster than she could run. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more true crime.